Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. God bless you. Hopefully you are doing well. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Sojourner Truth today. Got a chance to talk about Sojourner Truth, and I wanted to kind of to come to you and bring and do something a little bit different on YouTube. To come and talk a little bit about Sojourner Truth today. She's somebody who's on my heart and on my mind, and I'm sure she's somebody that you know and respect as well. And November 26, 1883 is when she passed away. So November 26 is the anniversary of her death, and so we're coming up on the anniversary of her death. And I want to recognize and I want to remember her for so many things. So I want to talk about a little bit, go through some things about her life, kind of walk through some of the important things and so many things that she contributed to us, I believe, into history and to America and to just in general. So much of what we'll be talking about, if you haven't had a chance to look, will be coming from her narrative. So her narrative of Sojourner Truth, her narrative talks about her life, and maybe you've had a chance to read it, maybe you've taken a look at it, but we're going to go through some parts of it now, some salient points that really jump out at me that hopefully you can share too. And put your information down in the comments. Let's share this with somebody and talk about it. So talking about Sojourner Truth in her life. So she was born more than likely in 1797. And unfortunately, we can't say we know 100% for sure exactly what year she was born in, because that's what happened in slavery. People, you didn't know exactly when you were born. Sometimes records were not kept and you were not respected as a person. So she was probably born around 1797, maybe somewhere to the 1800s or thereabouts. We're not 100% sure. We do know that she was born. And it's interesting. So the backdrop of her life is something that tells a little bit of a story for the first part of her life. It tells a little bit of a story of the emancipation in New York. A lot of times we think about slavery from other areas, but when we think about New York and New York State, it's important to note that in 1799, on July 4th, 1799, the state of New York passed what was a gradual emancipation law. So essentially what they said was, anybody, they didn't stop slavery all the way. And a lot of places in the North and a lot of states in the North did not stop slavery right away. And New York was the same way. They did not stop slavery right away. Many places didn't stop slavery, period, unless it was gradually or through the Civil War, as a result of the Civil War. But in New York, in New York State, essentially what they said was in July 4th, 1799, they passed a law, and it said anybody born after that date, July 4th, 1799, would be free if they were a female when they became the age of 25, and if they were a male when they became the age of 28. And so Sojourner Truth might have been born just before that. So it was a gradual thing. So if you were born in 1800, you had 25 more years to be enslaved if you were a woman, and 28 more years to be enslaved if you were a man. And some people were fortunate enough to fortunately be freed very soon. So that happened. So that was 1799. And eventually what it would say come 1817, it would say if you were born between 1817 and 1827, then you could be free as of July 4th, 1827. So they passed an additional law after about 18 years or so to try to capture those people who were born before 1799, which Sojourner Truth might have been in the same situation, because if you were born after 1799 at a certain date, you were free at age 25 if you were female and free at age 28 if you were male. But what about if you were born before that date? You could essentially be enslaved for the rest of your life. So they tried to capture that as well. So Sojourner Truth was in a situation where she was born, let's say 1797 or thereabouts, in New York, and she's born in upstate New York. And as she's there, you probably are aware that New York was a Dutch colony. Before the English took it from the Dutch, it was a Dutch colony. And so as a Dutch colony, Sojourner Truth was there, and her family was enslaved by Dutch people. So she would have spoken Dutch. She would have spoken a form of Dutch, a blended form of Dutch, and her family would have spoken. Her mother and father, her father's name was James. And you can see right there, her mother's name was Betsy. So James and Betsy, they were there in New York. They had probably 10 or 12 children. So Sojourner Truth's family was a large family. Unfortunately for James and Betsy, just about all of their children, pretty much all of their children were sold away from them in horrible conditions. So they were owned by a man named Ottenberg. And when he died, his son ended up taking over their family. And his son ended up buying a new house and turning his house into a hotel. And he took Sojourner Truth, her little brother Peter, her mother and father, and other people that he owned, and he put them in the cellar of his home that was run as a hotel. So they were in the cellar of this hotel, and they were the workers in the hotel. They were doing the work, and they slept on these damp floors underneath the house in the cellar. And Sojourner remembers how her mother would tell her about her older brothers and sisters, and it would tell her stories about her brothers and sisters. And she was the second to the youngest. So Sojourner Truth was one of the younger children, with the second to the youngest. And her mother told her a story about her older brothers and sisters and how they were sold away, where she thought they may have been, and she really didn't have much of an idea. But in one instance, Sojourner remembers her mother, Betsy, telling her that At one point in time, her older brother and sister, when they were younger, her brother was about 5 years old. One day he got up in the morning and he was especially happy that day. He was just running around, just being happy. And all of a sudden a man came up to the house where they were being enslaved, and he was in a sleigh, literally in a sleigh. This is the 1800s or the 1700s really in New York. He's in a sleigh, and he comes in and he takes Sojourner's her brother, her 5-year-old brother, and he puts him in a sleigh, and he takes the sister as well. One of her sisters takes her and puts her inside a box and locks her inside a lockbox in this sleigh. And he locks her inside there. And the little boy, her brother, just freaks out. He sees his sister being locked in a box, literally on the sleigh, and he screams and he freaks out, and he runs into the house, and he runs into a room underneath and gets underneath the bed and tries to hide. But it doesn't matter. He had been sold. So this is what was happening. Her brother and sister had been sold, unbeknownst to the mother and father, obviously, with no input, obviously, or word from the mother and father. Their children were just sold. And he grabbed the boy. The person who bought him grabbed the boy, took him and put him in a sleigh, and rode away with the girl, the sister, in a lockbox, and the boy in the sleigh with them as he rode off. Never to really see their family again, almost. And so Sojourner had those kind of stories and those type of backdrop as her life. And these are the types of things that she went through. And so many people who endured slavery, so many people who had to endure the hardships and ridiculousness of slavery, had to go through so much. And in my opinion, were heroes. And sometimes you're born into a life that is no fault of your own. You didn't do anything to deserve this, but you're born into a heck of a credible and crazy situation. How do you respond to it? And the way she responded is just remarkable. And I think she can tell so much to our lives. There's nothing good that came out of slavery. There's nothing good about slavery, but the people who went through it and triumphed over it, in my opinion, are people who are heroes, people we should remember. And so what happened with Sojourner as her life went on, the person who was owning them at the time also passed away, and she ended up being sold. So she was literally auctioned off. So her autobiography talks about this. It talks about her being auctioned off for $100 at the age of 9, along with some sheep that he owned. So here was this girl, a female woman, a young child here, who's 9 years old, who's being sold with sheep, for $100. And if you read Frederick Douglass, he talks about auctioning. He talks about what happens when an owner dies and how people are valued with animals. That's exactly what happened to Sojourner as a child. So she was 9 years old and she was sold to a man who was very cruel to her, who was mean to her, and she ended up being able to leave him. And thankfully, through some prayers, she believes, was able to leave him and ended up being sold to a man who owned a tavern, who was a fisherman. And then from there, she was sold to another man named Dumont, who would be the person who would own her for the rest of the time that she was in slavery. And when you think about this, she also experienced, so by the time she gets to Dumont, it's still in New York. All of this is in New York, the state of New York. She is maybe 13 years old. Maybe she's 12 or 13 or thereabouts. We're not 100% sure of her age, but she would have been a teenager in her early teens. And, she begins to be abused by it. He abuses her. He rapes her. She's abused by him. She experiences sexual abuse. She experiences verbal abuse, the abuse of being enslaved. She experiences whippings. How do you, as a young child who's 12 or 13 years old, maybe 14, if that, deal with somebody who owns you and owns and has the right to do anything they want to do with you? How do you deal with them wanting to advance on you and basically rape you? You have no agency. You have no ability to say no. And that's the same thing I argue when people talk about Sally Hemings, and they say Sally Hemings maybe had a choice when she was in France with Thomas Jefferson. People leave out completely that she was like 14 when she went to France. She was 14 and he was 44. So he was like 30 years older than her, and he owned her entire family. He owned her mother, her brothers and sisters, her cousins, and he was somebody who was considered her owner. That's who that was. He could do anything to her and her family. People act like she had agency, like she had the ability to say no. When somebody has the ability to sell you or your family, and you don't have the ability to say no, that's not consent. Consent is actually the ability to say no without the threat of anything bad happening to you. So people say that about Sally. I don't know why they say that. She was young when Thomas Jefferson started raping her and attacking her. And so was Sojourner Truth when her owner started raping her and attacking her. So she's, like I said, she's young. She's in New York. She's being attacked by her owner. And she's now experiencing, how can she deal with the hell of slavery? She mentions in her autobiography, she mentions that when she was sold at the age of 9, she said, now the war had begun. She mentioned that the war that she was going to be destined to fight for her life, the war against slavery, for abolition, the war also for women's rights, because she was one of the few people who were not only abolitionists, African Americans who were abolitionists, but also stood up for women's rights because she had the opportunity to, because she was such a speaker and such in demand. and as such a force. But she was fighting not only for women's rights, but for Black people's rights, and coming at America and coming at people who looked at inequality in a way that judged both sides of this. Let's look at all sides of this when we talk about people are free and created equal. Let's challenge this whole idea of sexism, this whole idea of racism, this whole idea of classism, elitism. She challenged so many things in a very eloquent and wisdom and wise way, if you ask me. So she mentioned at 9 years old, when she was sold away from her parents, that the war had begun, and that she was beginning her fight that would be a fight for justice. And she didn't know where it would take her. She ends up, as I'm mentioning, having a very strong religious and connection with God. And she mentioned that her mother, who told her about her brothers and sisters and told her about, when you look up at the stars and you see the moon, you're seeing the same moon and stars that your brothers and sisters are seeing wherever they are in the world, wherever they are might be in this area. And so she used the teachings from her mother to always stick with her. She believed that she had to develop a relationship with God, that she could talk to God, and that anything she asked for specifically, God would give her. That was something that led her through difficult times that many other people just would not walk through. She went through places in her life, which she'll talk about, that many other people would just not go. So as I mentioned to you, so you had this gradual emancipation law that was passed in 1799. And then as I mentioned, they had an 1817 law that was passed. And by this time, Sojourner Truth is being enslaved by Dumont, probably being attacked by her in New York. And this 1817 law said anybody born before the 1799 date would be free by the age of 21 or by July 4th, 1827, and that anybody who was born in between those dates could be free by the time they were 21. So if you were born before that 1799 date, you're free by July 4th, 1827. And if you were born in between 1817 and 1827 date, you're free when you're 21 years of age. I know this is very convoluted, and you can look it up. This is how they passed the law. So now that born before the 1799 date, you're free by the time of July 4th, 1827. This applied to Sojourner Truth, apparently. And she understood, she knew these laws existed. And so she had a conversation. Apparently her owner promised her that he would set her free. She would be set free 1 year before that 1827 date, 1 year before the date that the state had set that she would be free. He would set her free a year ahead of time. By this time, Sojourner has several children. Just to give you a heads up, she had her first child, we believe, passed away very shortly after childbirth. Her second child was probably a child that was fathered by her owner who was raping her. She had it as a result of that rape. And then the next three children she had as a result of marrying an older man named Thomas, who was enslaved by their same slave owner. And she had her last three children by him. And so her children, especially her younger children, probably would have fallen in that time where they were born between 1817 and 1827, and they would have been free by the time they were 21. So all of this is very important to Sojourner Truth's life and the things that she would do next. So he's promised her that she would be free on basically July 4th, 1826. She'd be free in 1826. And as the time came for her to be free, she approached him and she said, you mentioned you promised me that I would be free, now it's 1826 and I'd be free a year ahead of time. I want to make sure that's still going to happen. You're still going to, honor your word. And he says to her, no, that's not going to happen because you got hurt a while back. Some time ago, you hurt your hand. And you really didn't give me a year's worth of work. You really didn't give me a good work. You didn't give me enough work and enough productivity. So I'm going to have to keep you for longer. And Sojourner Truth was fired up. She was mad, and she talked about and thought about, the idea of being God, like the idea of not lying, of telling the truth. She had done so many things to the point of even denying food to her own children so that she wouldn't be seen as if she was taking too much food from the owners, from the white people who own her. She wanted to make sure that she was living up to God's word and not even be thinking like she was taking food. She denied food to her own children. To be in a situation where this man promised her freedom and then to turn around and say no, she felt he was lying and he was being a hypocrite. And so it's 1826. She decides, you know what, I'm going to leave. He promised me he was going to leave. I'm going to leave. I'm not going to take this. And she ends up spinning. She was spinning like a certain amount of wool. I think she spun 100 pounds of wool. And when she finished that task, she got up early in the morning at dawn and she took her youngest daughter, her youngest child with her, and she just walked away. She walked away from slavery. She said, I'm not going to take this. I'm not going to be abused. I'm not going to allow him to lie to me. I'm going to walk away. And so she walked and she didn't go far. She said purposely she did not go far. She ended up going to a house and she figured he would probably find her because this was a small area. This is not like big, huge, millions and millions of people. This is still rural at this time in New York and maybe somewhat rural today, but it was still rural. And sure enough, she ended up being at a house that took her in. And sure enough, he did find her. Not short time after that, he came and he found her in this house with these people who agreed to take her in. And he was like, "Okay, Isabella," because that was her name, Isabella, "you ran away from me." And she said, "I did not run, I walked. And I took my child with me. You promised me that I would be able to leave, and basically you lied, and I'm not going back. I didn't run from you, I walked." And she basically, and I didn't even walk far. I knew you would come. And so, he's there and he's like, "You're coming back with me and I'm going to take the child." She was like, "Heck no, you're not taking my child. There's no way you're taking my child." Then she's about to get really feisty. And the people whose house she was at, they basically said, okay, wait a minute. We don't like this. We don't like slavery. But if we can pay you for her services for a year, will you just let her go? Leave her here. You don't have to go. We'll pay you for her for the year, and you can just leave her here, and she can stay with us. And he said, yes, the owner. So the people that were helping, that were helping Sojourner Truth, they paid $20 for her and $5 for the child. He charged them for the child as well. And they ended up paying the $25 to him, and he left Sojourner Truth alone and let her stay in the house. And she was basically free. That's how she got free. So she essentially walked away from slavery, and these kind people helped her not be forced back into slavery by paying the $25 for her services for the rest of the year. And so, but the crazy thing about it, and which makes me think about so many things that she had to go through it, and why, if you get a chance to read her autobiography, it tells you so much about her. At this time when this was happening, another remarkable thing, an incredible thing happened to her. Unfortunately, that this man who owned her, who was bargaining for her year's time, if you will, who wanted to take her back, who had raped her, he around the same time, unbeknownst to her, sold her youngest son named Peter. And she named her youngest son apparently after her brother, her youngest brother. But he sold Peter, and Peter was about 5 years old. He sold Peter, unbeknownst to Sojourner Truth, to a man named Dr. Getney, Now, Getney was a doctor, and he was going to England, and he was going to take Peter at 5 years old with him to England to be a helper and to basically enslave the boy in England. And to enslave the boy with him. And so he does this, and slavery is not outlawed yet in the British colonies. Just to let you know, at this time it's not outlawed yet, even though it would be shortly thereafter. So he's going to take Peter with him, Sojourner Truth's son. He bought him. But as he gets to New York City and he's getting there, he's going to get on a boat. He says, "You know what? I don't think this boy is going to help me. I don't think he's going to be useful. He's too young to really be useful for what I need him to do." So this doctor turns around and sells Peter, Sojourner Truth's son, to his brother named Solomon Getney, back in the area, in the town where Sojourner Truth was living. He sells him to his son, to his brother. He sells her son to his brother named Solomon Getney. So Solomon Getney then turns around and sells Sojourner Truth's son to his brother-in-law in Alabama. So Solomon Getney's sister, her name was Eliza. She had married a man whose name was Flowers, who lived down in Alabama, who owned a big plantation. And so he was selling Peter, Sojourner Truth's son, to his brother-in-law, his sister's new husband, down, and sent him down to Alabama. And when Sojourner Truth found out that, she was horrified. I mean, here's this guy selling her son out of state, and the gradual emancipation laws that were in place in New York were already there. They were already in place. And that meant that her son, if he was in Alabama, he wasn't going to be free at 21. What are the chances that the people in Alabama were going to send him back to New York so he could be free? What are the chances of that? And so she's like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And her heart just broke. And she said, what do I need to do? But, as I mentioned, she was a woman of faith. And she would not let this go. And so what she did was start to act immediately. She went around to try to find people who helped her. And it's important to note, because Solomon Getney and his family, as I mentioned, his sister was down there in Alabama. It was his sister's husband that he sold Sojourner Truth's son to. And when Sojourner Truth went to go ask him, she wanted to confront him, like, why did you sell my son down to Alabama? You weren't supposed to do that. So she was confronting him. She came into contact, he wasn't there. She came into contact with his mother at their home. And she asked his mother, why would your son sell my son to Alabama? And his mother, Mrs. Getney, said to her, why are you making so much fuss over a little N-word boy? Why are you over a little boy? And she used the N-word. Why are you making so much fun over this little black boy? Is your child any better than mine? My child Eliza's down there, and that's her husband, and your child is being treated like a gentleman. He's getting everything he needs. She's not even thinking slavery and looking at it as horrible slavery is. He's getting everything he needs. And is your child any better than mine? Why are you making all this fuss? Because I hear you're going around town telling everybody that your son was sold. You're making a lot of fuss over nothing, over a little black boy. And so Sojourner was basically saying to her and to the other people who basically laughed at her for making so much fuss about her son, I will have my son. Go ahead and laugh. You laugh in my face. face, you deride me, but I'm praying to God, I will have my son. No matter, I will have my son. So she ends up going to Quakers, some Quakers who were there in New York, and people told her to go to them. And she told them their story. What should you do? They told her to go down to the courthouse, that the only thing you could do is to go to the courthouse. These laws had been passed. What he did was illegal. Your son should not have been sold out of state to Alabama. See if the courts will help you. She didn't even know what a court was, what a grand jury was. She'd never been in a court. She'd never owned $1 in her life. And I don't even think she had on shoes at this time. She was walking literally barefoot. That's the situation she was in. But she had faith and she had courage. So she went straight into that room, that courtroom. She didn't even know who to talk to, who was the grand jury, until she finally found the grand jury, because she was talking to everybody, telling them her story, giving them the impassioned details of her story. And she finally gets to the grand jury room, and the grand jury hears her argument. And one of the grand jurors stood up and asked her to come in the back room. And they brought several other people with them, constables and several other people with them. And they said, okay, say your story again. And she was so convincing. And she touched the hearts of all the people there, and they made her swear to and attest to follow the law, that this is your child. And they were convinced. We believe this is your child. So what they did was they put together an order, a summons to be summoned against Solomon Gedney, an order to send to him to basically say, we believe you violated the laws of the state of New York, and you have to go get that boy and bring him back to New York. Get him from Alabama and bring him back to New York. If you don't, you could suffer 14 years in jails and up to $1,000 in fines. And so Solomon Gedney, when he heard that and he got a lawyer, his lawyer said, you better go get the boy. He said, okay, he wasn't going to do it, but he said, okay, I don't want to go to jail. He goes to get the boy once he got the word that he was being summoned and that a court order was being put against him. So he goes, and apparently he leaves in the fall to go get her son back down from Alabama. And it takes him months. He doesn't seem like he comes back right away. He stays for a long period of time. He leaves in the fall. He doesn't get back till spring. And so he comes back in the spring. He brings the boy back into town. He's back in town. He's back in New York, back home. But he says he's not giving up the boy. He's like, this is my property. I bought him and I don't have to give him. I'm not giving him away. And so the lawyers let Sojourner know, the lawyer was helping her, let her know that, hey, your son is back in town, but we can't get him. We can't have a court case to figure out the legality of this and what happened and have a ruling until the next court session, which might be some months away. And she was like, months. He was like, yes, it's a months away. This is how it works. Be happy that your son is back in New York and not in Alabama. That's a remarkable thing. I wasn't even sure that was going to happen, but you should be thankful. And she said, you don't understand. God told me I would have my son now. And I'm not waiting. This idea, she didn't understand and she didn't accept why I needed to wait for months. I hear your procedure, but God didn't tell me that. God didn't tell me to wait months. And so she left him and she was kind of dejected, and she understood that a lot of people in town were getting tired of her. That she was making such a fuss. This is a mother's love, right? She was making such a fuss that people in town and even people who were helping her were getting tired of her. She's coming around. She's always asking about her son. She's getting services from lawyers. Some of them are doing this for free, and they're getting tired of her. And she's like, Lord, I don't even, maybe even God is getting tired of me. Everybody seems like they're getting tired of me. I don't know what else to do, but God, you told me I would have my son immediately. And whatever I ask for specifically, I get. I know that you granted to me. Please help me. And there she is standing around town, probably barefoot, walking around. And a man who knew of her situation, because so many people knew of her situation because she was making such a fuss of this as she should have to save her son. A man came up to her and said, you're the woman. How's your boy? Have they given you your boy back yet? And she told him everything. She said, no. He said, you know what? Go to that man right there. There's a man named Demand. He's a lawyer in town. Go to his house. His house is that stone house right there. He pointed at it. He said, and convince him, make him help you. I think if you are adamant with him, he will help you. So, that was her strength. One of her strengths is to be adamant. She went right to the man's house, apparently trotting, not just walking, went straight to the man's house, and she knocks on the door. He opens up and she tells him her whole story. And, she's begging him, help me. She's being very, demonstrative and very, demanding of it. And he was like, finally, okay, you know what? I'll help you. If you bring me, I need $5 from you. If you bring me $5, I will have your son in 24 hours. Just bring me $5. And he was like, and she was like, I don't have $5. He said, well, if the $5 is not for me, I'm not going to charge you for my services, but there's a man who I work with who gets things done. I'd like to know who this man was, actually, when I hear the story. There's a man who gets things done. And if I give him the $5 is to pay him, if he gets that $5, he will get your son and Solomon Gedney within 24 hours. He'll get them. Don't worry about that. He makes things happen, but I need to pay him. And so Sojourner Truth was like, I've never owned a dollar in my life. I've never had a dollar in my life. Where am I going to get $5? The man said, maybe try the Quakers who helped you initially, who told you to go down to the courthouse, see if they will get the money for you. So she went, and I think the distance from his house, this lawyer's house, to where the Quakers were was like 8 to 10 miles. She trots. She can't walk. She's about trotting. And remember, she's probably barefoot. She's trotting down to this house where the Quakers are. And she gets there and she tells them everything. And they start to collect money. They go around the neighborhood and they start to collect money for her to give her so she can bring it back to Demand, this lawyer. His name is Demand. And they give her a sum greater than $5. I don't know exactly how much, but it was greater than $5. It was more than $5. And she gets the money, and immediately when she gets the money in her hand, she just puts it in her hand and runs back. She doesn't walk. This woman is covering the space of 8 to 10 miles, not hesitating, because she wants her son now, and that's what God promised her. When she gets to the man's house, she knocks on the door. He opens the door. She takes his hand, and she puts all the money in his hand, everything they gave her. And people asked her later on, they said, why didn't you just give him the $5? Like, why did you give him everything? Because you don't have money. You don't even have shoes. You might need that money for yourself. Why didn't you just give him the $5 and keep the rest for yourself? It would have been helpful. She said, I didn't want the money. I didn't care. I figured if this man who was going to do things and make things happen, if $5 would get my son, then more than that would certainly get my son. I didn't care about the money. I gave him everything. Let this happen. So she gave the man everything. And the man who was specialized in get things done, I don't know if he was a bounty hunter or whatever he did, but he was considered a specialist in this. Whatever he did, he got the boy. And he got Solomon Gedney. And I'm sure it wasn't a pleasant accosting that he did of them. He got him, and he got him within a 24-hour period of time. He went to go get the boy, but they took him down to the courthouse, and this lawyer who was helping Sojourner Truth came back to Sojourner Truth, and he let her know, as I mentioned, he let her know, we have your son. I told you we have him. We got him. I know you were worried, but he's down at the courthouse and he's screaming, he's crying. He says he doesn't have a mother in his place. He says he doesn't have a mother in his place, and that he just doesn't know where this place is. He's screaming and crying. We need you to come down. You have to come down to the courthouse, and you have to identify your son. This is how it has to work now. So Sojourner comes immediately. She comes down to the house. She gets there, and as soon as she walks into the courthouse, her son sees her and he screams. He starts screaming, and he looks at Solomon Gedney, the man who had sold him and brought him back, and it's like crying. It's like, that's not my mom. That's not my mom. He's screaming, right? And apparently Solomon Gedney had abused the boy and had threatened him and told the boy that bad things were going to happen to him if he was given back to this woman, and all kinds of things. So the boy is crying and screaming, and Sojourner is just in the corner. She sits down in the corner because she can see her son crying, and she just prays. She's like, God, I don't care what happens. I don't care anything about money. I don't care about any of this. I just want my son. So the lawyers start to argue that this man sold the boy out of town, sold him to Alabama, and then therefore he needs to pay. I mean, he at least owes a couple $100. He maybe need to go to jail, and maybe that money will go to Sojourner because this is how the law works. And she was thinking, I don't care anything about that. I just want my boy. I don't care anything about that. And she knew she was making a lot of enemies too. And so when the judge was asking the little boy questions, the little boy would look at Solomon Gedney, the man who sold him and then brought him back. He would look at him to answer. And every time he would say, and no, and this and that. And the judge would say, no, stop looking at him. Look at me when you talk. It was clear that he was being intimidated. And the judge asked him, now, where did you get the scar on your head? And the boy said, I got it from a horse down there in Alabama. Mr. Flowers' horse kicked me in the head. What about that scar that's on your cheek, that's on your face? Oh, I got that when I fell down the steps when I was in Alabama. And it was clear to the judge, as the judge continued to question him, that the little boy was being intimidated and being abused, and that Solomon Gedney had threatened him. And so the judge decided, after the whole court proceedings and everything was presented, that the boy had no other protector, no other person to take but his mother, and he remitted Peter into the hands of Sojourner Truth. So Sojourner Truth got him. He went back to his mother, and she got her son, and he was freed from slavery that day because of her diligence. Solomon Gedney, I don't think, going to jail. He ended up spending money as a result of it. Now, maybe he was fine, but he ended up going to jail. And Sojourner, she got her son, and he was still crying. He was still upset. He wasn't sure what's happening, whether Solomon Gedney was going to get him now that this judge had done whatever was happening. And he was still a boy of 5 years old. Remember, he's just 5 years old. So she goes to him, she calms him down. They're able to calm down. She hugs him, and she ends up looking at the scars on his face and looking at him. And she lifts up his back, and she said that he had whelps and wounds on his back that were like fingers when you put your hand together. They were so deep, they were like fingers, and that she ended up seeing scars almost from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, all over his body. He had whelps on him. This is a 5-year-old boy, and she asked him, "How did you do? Like, how did this happen to you? How did you deal with this? How did you stand this?" And he said, "Mom, you don't even understand. It wasn't just me. This was almost nothing. There was a woman there whose name was Phyllis, and she just had a baby. She was like a new mother. She had just had a little baby, and her chest was filled with milk. Her breasts were filled with milk. This guy Flowers used to beat her to the point where her milk and her blood mixed and fell on the floor at the bottom of her feet. That's how bad she was beaten. That he himself was beaten so bad, sometimes his back was so bloody that he would run up underneath the stairs and hide up under this really small way, and his back would stick to the part above him because he was bleeding so much. This man Flowers was beating the heck out of her child. And Sojourner Truth was able to save him from that. And had she not done that, he probably would have lived his life in Alabama or been sold again and never been free. And it talks about the faith, the incredible faith that she had. And she took this faith onto the road as she spoke to people and did speeches. And she mentions another part of the story that unfortunately, after this happened, she ended up working for one of the family members of this Getney group, and finding out as a result of being there, one day she's working, she's a housekeeper there, and the people come into the house and they're screaming, and they have a letter, and they go into Mama Getney's room. And Sojourner said that the spirit told her to walk into the room with them and listen to what they were saying. And she was like, black people didn't do that. People who were working in the house didn't walk into white people's room and just go into their bedroom and listen to what they were saying. But she said God told her to do it. So she did it. She went right into the room. She went to the bedroom. She walked in. She shut the door behind her, put her back up against the door, and listened. And in that, they read a letter to, I guess, the mother or the head of the house, if you will, and told them how Eliza, who was the woman, the sister of Getney, who was married to the man down in Alabama, how she was brutally murdered by her husband. He had jumped on her and broken her collarbone, attacked her windpipe, beat her to death, and brutally murdered her. And he was now in jail. And Sojourner Truth remembers praying when she saw her son that, God, what they did to my son, could you pay them back even double, the people who did this to my son? And she said she didn't know that if God would do something as drastic as that, but she felt like, wow, that was something that retribution came, and she didn't revel in it. She didn't rub it in their faces. She didn't feel good about it. She didn't pray and say, thank you, God. She just understood that when she prayed something to God, that God would have a retribution of justice, that God would come back and bring things on people who did wrong. And it wasn't her job to revel in making them feel bad or to feel good about it. Her job was to continue to serve God and to be a truth and to be humble, and to know that God will pay anybody if they do wrong, that karma is real, that karma will come back to you. I'm using the word karma. She didn't, but I'm using the word karma to explain what she said. So there's so many things about her. If you look at her story, her one of her speeches about the Ain't I a Woman speech, there's so many things that she did. And she may not have exactly said the words, ain't I a woman, but the way in which she talked to people, the way in which she represented womanhood, and the fight against slavery and equality was somebody who I think maybe she should be remembered. So I'd love to hear your comments. If you have any more comments, please share it down below. I'm going to try to do more of these. I want to do another one on Sojourner Truth very soon to talk about kind of the second half of her life or other things from her life. And I want to try to bring more of this information to you. So let me know if there are people you want to know or things you want to see. But God bless you. Thank you for remembering Sojourner Truth today. God bless you and have a good one. Thank you.